Good morning, everybody. Happy to see everybody here. We have a few housekeeping things before we get started, so I'm going to start in on that as people continue to trickle in. If you don't know me, my name is Anna Meadows, and I'm an outreach coordinator with the Springfield Community Gardens. We're a nonprofit based in Springfield, Missouri, whose vision is a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. And we do that through our network of 18 community gardens around Springfield, as well as our 4 farm incubator sites and educational opportunities like this training this morning. This workshop on moral injury and the military veteran is generously sponsored by the USDA OPPE 2501 grant program, which is the United States Department of Agriculture's Office of Partnerships and Public Engagement's 2501 grant program. And our speaker today is Reverend Dr. Tommy Goode. He's the founding director of the Moral Injury Institute here in Springfield, and I will let him introduce himself further in just a moment. But before we get started, I have been speaking with Dr. Goode, and we're excited to have this be a conversation more than a presentation. So please, if you have questions throughout, put them in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. So there's a couple ways you can do that. There is a Q&A button for any questions that you have throughout the presentation. There's also a chat button at the bottom of your screen where you can put comments throughout as well. So feel free to use either one of those throughout the presentation. I will be monitoring both of those and asking questions throughout the presentation. Also, once you leave this workshop, a screen will pop up with a link to a post-workshop survey. This survey is used in SDGs reporting to the USDA and also helps us provide meaningful workshops to all of you in the future. So we would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to fill that out at the end of this presentation. And if you'd like to refer to this workshop later on, it will be available on SDG's Agriculture Workshop playlist on our YouTube channel by the end of this week. I'll put that link as well as our website, social media, tonight's exit survey, and some more information about the Moral Injury Institute in the chat in just a moment. So that is it from me. Dr. Goode, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome.
Thanks, Anna, and good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead, Anna, and start up the presentation. And as Anna said, along the way, if you have a question or some point of interest, please share it and we'll try and respond as best we can. Or if there's something that you're wanting to know that isn't in this presentation, that's important to know as well. So I'm Tommy Goode, and I've been working in this subject matter since about the late 2014, when I first moved to Springfield. Heard a presentation seminar at Goode University about the struggle that veterans have, especially those who've been in combat. The other thing about this is that it isn't a one generational experience, but it's multi-generational. While the the landscape of war, or maybe even the technologies of war and combat have changed, the impact on the military personnel continues to be very relevant. One of the reasons that I'm motivated to try and have these community conversations and awareness builders is because even now, with all of the mental health resources we have, there's still somewhere around 22 veterans, persons who served in our military service, who are known to end their life with suicide every day. And that's just the sad tip of the iceberg of the effects that these experiences have on persons who serve in threat situations and combat. Additionally, I'm personally drawn to it struggles that my father went through. He was a World War II combat vet and subsequently had a lot of mental health issues. I didn't understand at that time, growing up in his household, all of what was going on. So it's helped me. And so this for me is more like a personal mission than just a project. And I should go ahead and say that if any of you or have served in our military or are family members of those who have, I just want to say thank you and how awesome it is that people still do that. And the cost, whether that's whatever it is, it separates families, it takes a toll on the individual. And so it's to be respected and honored and appreciated. Thank you very much. This is mission statement for moral injury as it was organized in 2018. That the Institute exists, and by the way, I'm based here in Springfield. It exists to create a reliable, sustainable web of care through training, advocacy, networking, strategic initiatives for veterans and others struggling with trauma-related moral injury. So if you want to know more about that, please reach out and connect to our website or Facebook. As with any conversation around trauma, I always want to be careful that I share with you my disclaimers. One is that any statements I make are mine. You should validate them for yourself or your situation. Also, it's designed only to be informational and educational. Comments and discussions and descriptions around trauma can be triggering, whatever the source of trauma in a person's life. So if you have trauma experience, then I just caution you that we want to be alert to that. And should any of the images or conversation or presentation trigger discomfort or dis-ease on your part, just step away, take a break. And if it's significant, obviously I encourage to seek support from someone close to you and or from a professional. With general introduction that I use for understanding trauma related, the adjective trauma related, because the need to understand the connection between a trauma event experience and its effect called moral injury are necessary. We today are simply trying to understand this subject matter a little more. And also we're looking at connections and relationships between agricultural work and those who experience moral injury. Moral injury then results when a moral threshold is transgressed. And by moral, I want to, we sometimes, depending on our life philosophies, assume this is some kind of religious term. It may very well be. It is a religious term for me personally, but moral has to do with any sense of what is right and wrong, what is good and bad. And so I might cross that threshold and it be a violation of like rules of engagement if I'm in the military or something like that. It is associated with traumatic experiences, and it is also very connected to behavioral issues. Here's a kind of a perspective that I think helps to begin to see the significance of the impact of moral injury. If you could imagine something happening to you, whether you caused it, you observed it, or you were just there when it happened, you longer think of yourself or the world as good. When you look inside, there's dark, a deep sense of failure, then that's moral injury. persons who struggle with the effects of trauma-related moral injury express it in feelings. Now, it'll show up in behavior as well, but these are the identifiers that people would say, this is how I feel. And these then are ways of beginning to understand that what they're really talking about is some level of moral injury. By the way, I should also quickly say that not everyone who is in the military, not everyone who's in combat or in threat situations develop this moral injury affect, but many do. And because of those who do, I feel it's necessary for us in the community to know more about the subject. So feelings of guilt, shame, regret, failure, and remorse sometimes shows up in terms as expressions of apathy or anger, withdrawal, isolation, often leading to self-harming behavior, and sometimes regretfully leads to acts of suicide. My father, I mentioned earlier, attempted suicide. My uncle, who was in the military, attempted suicide multiple times. And so this is a very real struggle that we need to be aware of. Here's a working definition that I have, but I also want us to contrast and compare PTSD and moral injury so that we don't confuse those. And I'll indicate to you in a minute why that's important. PTSD, as we are very familiar nowadays with that terminology, is fear-based. It's a fear-based response. It's reactive. Person will duck at a loud noise. If they've been in the military, they may just fall to the ground in terror, or helicopter coming overhead, or any kind of provocative, unexpected sound or activity in their environment can trigger this fear response. It's a defensive response, and it is pretty pervasive for those who have been diagnosed with PTSD. It is clinical and it's a medical category, and there are great resources available through the Veterans Administration and community mental health services to help persons with PTSD better manage the that on their lives. It is injury nonetheless, and sometimes veterans or those who work with veterans and their mental health talk about these injuries as being the invisible wounds. You know, you can see if somebody's body is mutilated or wounded, but it's not always apparent. These internal wounds, these hidden wounds, as some have described them. So moral injury is damage to the soul or the spirituality or the center core of identity of the individual. War is only one of, not the only thing that causes this kind of damage. And in our society and in many societies, such things as abuse, rape, violence, described it as soul wounded, and the healing process is soul repair. Other terms already in use then include such terms as soul wound and soul repair. Then if you notice that at the bottom of that, the distinction between PTSD and moral injury is that moral injury is emotion-based, not fear-based. It may, and I'll show you how they correlate in a minute. It's defined by feelings, guilt, shame, remorse, anger, despair, mistrust, loss of meaning, isolation. Connecting with behavioral expressions and issues, it is persistent, it is pervasive, and it is almost always based. Dr. Bucky Buckner, an MD here in Springfield, who himself was a deployed military physician in combat zones, says about the need for us to be cleared between the PTSD and moral injury, that just like with any other medical health issue, misdiagnosing PTSD with moral injury is life-threatening, if not life-ending. Here's a graphic that helps to look at the correlation, the distinctions, as well as how they overlap. And this is why it's sometimes very difficult to distinguish one from the other. PTSD being start reflex, it may show up as memory loss, fear, flash, night terrors, and so forth. Moral injury being emotion-based, is going to show up in a more emotive, affective part of our identity. But they correlate or cross over in similar ways. Both may be expressed through anger, depression, anxiety, insomnia, nightmares, self-medicating, abuse and use of drugs and alcohol, and other self-harming behaviors. There are three key insights as we begin to want to understand how this looks for the individual, and then how we as community can understand it in a deeper way. One is that moral injury is existential. It's whole person. It invades and affects all aspects of one's life experience. And it is, as I've already indicated, considered to be an invisible wound because it may have presenting symptoms, but because it's a moral wound, a moral injury, persons are extremely reluctant to manifest that even to themselves sometimes. And we'll talk a bit more about that. Another is that moral injury is masking, emotional masking, behavioral masking, and to understand that the cover-up of persons struggling with the moral injury is pretty well. The third, and perhaps the most important for our conversation, is we can help each other. Moral injury relates to being helped and healed in relationships. And all of the research that I know anything about would suggest that moral injury occurs because we are part of social structures, and it can only be resolved in and through social structures. Some categories of concern then: trauma-related moral injury. It's traumatic, it has moral meaning, and it has behavioral effects. But there is hope in that there can and often is healing and recovery. I like to think about it like this as well, using this graphic, that moral injury is a whole galaxy of identifiers. It shows up clinically in persons with PTSD. In fact, I more and more believe that if persons have been diagnosed with PTSD, then they very likely also have some level of moral injury. It'll show up in mood and behavior. It will also show up in relationships. It is a spiritual struggle in that whether the person is religious or not, it deals with the core identity of personhood and self-being. And it is resistant to easy fixes. Other spheres is in the workplace, in anxiety of being in social spaces, Often we discover it when the person is isolating, and they just go off the grid, as it's said. It may show up as grief, and it may also show up in health concerns. One of the insights that I think may be helpful is that when we talk about these moral categories of concern, that the guilt and shame comes down to an emphasis on self versus behavior. So I did that horrible thing is guilt. I did that horrible thing is shame. And we'll see that better illustrated in a few minutes in a video. Shame is considered the more painful because it's one's core self identity, not simply one's behavior that's at stake. And this is why it's so very difficult for persons to process and express, because why in the world would I want to tell someone about the thing that I'm most ashamed of in my life, as you might imagine? Shame can result from other people's perceptions of it. Like the persons who served in combat in Vietnam came back to a social America that referred to them as baby killers and demons and worse than that. And so the perception, the environment, many returning soldiers from the, and military personnel from Vietnam is an indicator of how complicated what other people think matters. Being more trauma aware, and we all should be trauma aware these days, just for our own health and well-being, but also for others. And with COVID, this is simply amped up, you know, I don't know how many degrees, but there's trauma all around us now. And we see that being acted out in public and private ways all around us in our culture, in our communities. Trauma looks like this by the one definition. It includes three elements. It's an event or series of events or circumstances that's experienced. So it's experiential by the individual as overwhelming, life-changing, and it has profound effects on that person's psychological development or well-being, often involving physiological, social, spiritual impacts. Another way to analyze this is to think about the aftermath of moral injury. One thing I think perhaps I should also comment on here. One day we were in a conference context and people were saying, well, how can we prevent moral injury? And one of the persons who spoke up and said, why would you want moral injury? You would not want to live with a humanity that did not have the capacity to experience moral injury, that had no moral compass. And so the best we are able to do is to help understand it and help people who struggle with it to recover and become more healthy, if you will. The aftermath of moral injuries, then, transgressive acts. By the way, I would want you to understand that moral injury almost always, not exclusively, but it almost always happens if it's military related in failing to prevent the harm to the innocent. Many of us who've not served in military might think, well, of course you would have moral injury if you had to fire weapons and it resulted in the death of human beings. And that's one quality. But the moral injury of regret and shame is the consequence of not preventing or somehow contributing to the harm or death of someone who is perceived as innocent in that situation. Emotional responses, then, we've already looked at, having internalized that. And it may not make sense to anyone else but that individual, but they come to some conclusion that they are a horrible person, an evil person. They cannot be forgiven. And so they carry this life load of guilt and shame that kind of betrays their own sense of moral humanity. So it shapes our beliefs, our worldview, our spirituality, and our identity, and it viciously loops. And this is what makes it a syndrome, because it loops over and over and over. Here's just some of the labeling that someone struggling with this trauma-based moral injury might identify with. I'm going to show a brief video of a military serviceman who is active in Vietnam, and his name is Dale. I have his permission to use this video for training purposes only. So I'm always grateful to Dale for being willing to tell us his story and let us help us understand what it looks like from his experience. By the way, this may trigger, and so if his story you think might be triggering, just please step away.
I was in the United States Navy. I was an engineman, and I was in the reserves from 66 to...
Sorry. Here we go.
I was in the United States Navy. I was an engineman, and I was in the reserves from 66 to 76. I went active duty in July of 68 and was stationed with the Mobile Riverine Force in the Delta in South Vietnam. Then came November 1st, well, October 31st, we got me a coxswain to come out and help me and pull away from the boat and started our patrol. And then you throw hand grenades occasionally every once in a while up and down in front of the boats. We're protecting it from sappers. Then around a little after 3 o'clock, the world came to an end. They went in and started pulling gear out. There was weapons in there. There was 27 bodies in there. I think 17 or 18 was crew members from the Westchester, and the rest of them was Army personnel, 9th Infantry. They'd pull 2 or 3 out and lay them on the bow, and I'd take the boat around, put it next to the barge, and they'd offload them. My problem with this is I was assigned as a picket boat. I was to protect these guys. I did my circles back and forth, round. I didn't do the same maneuver all the time. And I let 1, 2, 3, I don't know how many divers come by with 2 large mines. You couldn't dive too deep with these things. The river current was too quick down there, and you had to bob up every once in a while to see where you're going. You just don't float down a river flowing at a good clip, and hopefully hitting something. So they had to look up. They had to poke their heads out of the water.
Yeah.
And I let them by me.
Yeah.
I failed. died. Ever since I've blamed me.
Anna, I think maybe I'd like for us to just take a pause here and let anybody share anything that they may be thinking or questions right now, and then I come back to the remainder of the presentation. And you just may want to represent the group.
Very good. Yes, I'll keep an eye out on the Q&A section and the chat below. If you have any questions or comments about what we've talked about so far, feel free to put them in either one of those spaces. Dr. Goode, I know this presentation is specifically on the experience of military veterans, but SDG works closely with military veterans and Cox Health and other members of the community. Are there other communities that are often associated with moral injury?
Yeah, there really are, and there's a lot of research now being done around this, but you might think of first responders, persons who deal, police departments, fire departments, EMTs, who are the front line, the first persons there where there's accident, injury, threat and harm. They very like have similar kinds of experiences. And interesting research is being done now that even healthcare workers are experiencing moral injury, particularly through COVID, because they lost their ability to do patient care the way they've been trained to do so, the way they felt was right. And physicians, not just persons in the critical care units or ERs, but persons who work in clinics, who have to deal with choices for the health and well-being of their patient, that may not be able to do what they really want to do just because of the way health is managed. So there are lots of opportunity for impact of this sort of thing. And then I mentioned earlier, I haven't shown it yet, we have to be aware nowadays of early childhood trauma. And there's a high alarming population of persons who've experienced some kind of trauma in their early childhood. And that becomes shaping for their lives. Even the military now is screening for early childhood trauma as a predictor of persons who might develop moral injury, in fact, or PTSD. And so and I mentioned in the definition earlier, anyone, if someone's been assaulted, either domestically or on the street, whatever, and that can create this kind of scenario of that leads to moral judgment or moral incrimination on the part of the individual. Domestic abuse is a huge opportunity for this kind of wound to be experienced, because domestic abuse, oftentimes the person being abused has a lot of misguided sense of personal blame for the abusive experience. So there's just a lot of different life arenas that this can clearly show up in.
Could you comment on moral injury issues with refugee populations?
Refugees. Well, I think we know that just from news stories, the trauma that these persons who are coming currently into the US and in refugee status are coming from life-threatening circumstances. So they're fleeing for their lives, and they may have experienced or witnessed great harm, emotionally and physically, on the part of someone in their home environment, the place they come from, and so they're running their lives. That very much matches up with our understanding of PTSD. And then if that carries with it a sense of moral failure, then that can lead to moral injury. Okay, do we have any questions?
We do. We have a couple of anecdotes and a couple of questions. So the first says, I think this is super interesting. I think that relates to maybe what doctors could go through with things that they could have done to help a person. I recently went through a loss where I wondered what I could have done as a dietitian to help my family member avoid the health issues that exhibited. So an example of what we've been talking about.
Absolutely, very, very appropriate. Okay,
And
well, I'll go ahead.
Have a couple more questions if that's all right.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Okay, so the first one is an anecdote and a question. So this kind of guilt expressed by veterans is something that I've heard about anecdotally for my whole life. But unlike PTSD, I've never heard it defined with the clinical term before. Are mental health care providers using this now as a clinical diagnosis, or is it still on the leading edge of research, so to speak? You may be presenting on this later on.
Yeah, it is now in the clinical language of the VA. In fact, the whole concept of moral injury is a result of military medical science, mental health science. So it kind of comes from that community. But now the military and the VA are training their spiritual caregivers, the chaplains and persons, social related giving, and how to help someone and understand the dynamics of moral injury. So that's one way it's being implemented. If you just do a general search, you'll find quite a lot out there now around the conversation of moral injury. So it's no longer a hidden subject matter. It is not a psychiatric category. Some are advocating that it becomes. I know some people who are advocating with AMA and APA that moral injury become a classification of psychiatric care. But I'm not sure that it ever will, because it isn't clinical in the sense that PTSD is. So typically, persons who are classified clinically with post-traumatic stress may also, through their care provider, be responded to and assessed for moral injury.
You also mentioned the military screening for early childhood trauma. How do they, or how might they use that information to help service people with that kind of trauma?
You skipped out. You skipped out on me. I didn't hear everything you just said.
I'll repeat it, no problem. You mentioned earlier the military screening for early childhood trauma. Do you know how they might use that information to help support people with that kind of trauma?
Well, they do it as a profiling of the military personnel coming into military service, just like they would profile, a chronic disease or something like that. So it goes into the individual's profile, and depending on how prominent or prevalent the symptoms are, whether or not they would qualify for military service.
Okay, those are all the questions we have right now.
All right, well, let's get back to the presentation. So when we think about how pervasive and all of that moral injury is, then the question is, so what do you do about it, or what can you do about it? And I'm just I'm abbreviating all of this for today's presentation. But some of the things that are interventions, and this is going to lead us hopefully into the conversation on agriculture. Rituals of forgiveness are necessary. Self-forgiveness. The part of the story that Dale shared that wasn't in the video was he hasn't forgiven himself, and he doesn't expect to ever forgive himself. So what are some rituals then? Well, maybe they're religious, maybe they are just simply mindfulness, maybe they are you know, doing things that is good for yourself rather than harming for yourself. So rituals of forgiveness can be quite broad and extensive, but they do need to be embraced somehow, some way, for the person to experience for this sense of shame or failure. The other then part of a relational community is huge. It cannot be overstated. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated, because when we're talking about military, because sometimes the military builds such a strong sense of group cohesiveness, teamwork, and camaraderie that that it becomes life-shaping. And so one of the huge issues of persons coming out of military and back into society is losing that sense of connectedness, that sense of belonging to a team, to a group. And so part of what those of us who try and work with this population do is to achieve for there to be veteran on veteran experience. Like I lead two different groups right now in the community, one around music and one around writing, but they are veteran participant only. And that is necessary because we're doing it as a therapeutic experience. And so being veteran to veteran allows for more transparency, allows for more trust, allows for more openness, and just for a more positive experience of being with others. It isn't exclusive, and it doesn't mean that you've got to be one to help and care, but it is a strong veterans. If you can do them veteran non-veteran or veterans in small groups, I just think it works better. Activities that are tactile and creative is another intervention. One researcher that I know concluded that there is no recovery for combat veterans that doesn't include some kind of physicality. And her research is pretty respected at this point. So things that are tactile in terms of physicality and creative in terms of expressiveness pair really well when it comes to being an intervention strategy for especially those in the military. Participating in, and there would be other groups that might have that same group participating in act of kindness, doing good. Many have found it useful even to go back to the country where they were in the military and do acts of kindness, go back and revisit those populations and try and help. Or it doesn't have to be in country, it can just be in community, but doing things that help others. And this is why I think our idea of engaging veterans more with Springfield Community Gardens is so powerful. Doing good, doing acts of kindness. Psychological, emotional, relational, spiritual, all together in these paradigms. The goal then of healing or recovery from moral injury is empathy. I'm involved in a research project with MU analyzing the power of empathy for oneself as a amendment, and we're finding it to be a positive dynamic. The same strength that results in moral injury can also be used in building and healing narrative for those who suffer. Forgiveness of self, forgiveness of others, recognition of symptomology, and increasing self-regulation. Self-regulation is a part of the conversation we need to be looking at in a few minutes with regard to the gardening program. So here's some research. There's lots out there, and I know we have a online with us, Patrick Byers, who is a real knowledge expert in all of this. So maybe we'll learn more from Patrick. But I just found these and back to 2009 project that was assessed by the Peers Foundation, and it was in Glasgow. But anyway, the idea then of gardening in this program, they call it gardening leave for veterans, and it was working with veterans who were in institutional care. So that's why they called it gardening leave. But it has, I think, relevance for our conversation. Veterans interviewed suggested that the impact of gardening leave or their experience in the gardening program on them could not be overestimated. They use words like lifesaver in a very real sense. It gave structure, it gave a sense of achievement to those prone to serious bouts of depression and who were extremely socially isolated in the civilian world. Many veterans relying on them to issues such as confidence building, sense of purpose, self-respect, learning, and some impacts of gardening leave might be viewed as holistic instead of clinical. And I think that's important to say in the context of our conversation today, is that we're not proposing a clinical approach to this issue. We're in fact proposing just the opposite. That is a holistic or a social or community-based approach, relational kind of approach. Here's some more research out of VA experience of doing things that are creative, whether it's kind of engagements. I think it pertains relevantly to gardening. So some outcomes that they found from these positive experiences, these creative outlets, were there was a physical benefit. It increased well-being, abilities to improve pain management and such things as that. There was an emotional benefit in that it developed positive coping strategies, decreased anxiety, enhanced creative expression. Social, increased knowledge of community resources, improved appropriate social function and interpersonal skills, and facilitated independence and confidence. And then finally, the cognitive, it increased sustained and alternating attention, which is a big mental health concern. cognitive, so that the individual with the cognitive impairment doesn't ideate on the negative and on the um, um, unsolvable, and yet begins to think outside that dynamic. It improves time management. So there may be others. Sometimes I would want to say, we don't need an advice column. We don't need someone to say, well, I think you should be doing this or this or this. We just simply need people to be in our corner. As the military would say, have our six or have our back, to be there for us. They're reliable, and that we can rely on them and depend on them to know that one simple thing, they care, and we can trust the fact that they really do care. I thought maybe it might be helpful to just say, you know, whether we're talking about this program or in your ordinary life, if you're in the company of someone, you know, someone you're a friend to, an associate with, a colleague of, a spouse, a family member, and they struggle with some of these mental health concerns, then sometimes we say, well, I don't know what to say. I'm afraid I'll say the wrong thing. Or if I don't mention it, then maybe they won't think about it. You know, we get into all these negative typecasting. So the real thing that matters is to talk to people. And here's just some prompters that you might, if you're concerned about someone and their mental health, you might just say something to the effect of, how are you? And really listen then. Are you okay? You don't seem okay. I've noticed that you appear frustrated. I noticed this particularly with persons who are dealing with Alzheimer's and dementia, and some of the other emerging life situations, that these things are obvious to an observer, but they may not be obvious to the individual. And so we can prompt just by inquiring. But more than that, to assure verbally, not just physically. Don't assume that, well, they know I care about them. No, verbalize that, express that. I would even think in terms of signage, you know, in a garden plot. Positive messaging could occur. Inquiring kind of messaging could occur. You could say something, well, seems like something's up. You want to talk about it? What's going on? Explore that. All right. I have developed an approach that I use that is kind of like storyboarding. And this can be done verbally, it can be done socially, but it's allowing the person to shape their trauma story in such a way that it begins to allow them to unpack it. Here are some of the things that are affected and can be identified and measured in terms of how a person is on any given day or time, with the factors of shame, guilt, regret, so forth, all of these identifiers with moral injury. And then the other part of that is to look at resiliency, not just look at the problem, but look at the resiliency, the strength builders, the coping mechanisms. And so some of those categories are hope and forgiveness and acceptance and counseling and faith and self-understanding and fitness and family and gardening. Okay, Anna, let's talk.
Let's talk. All right. Wow, excuse me. Okay, we have one question right now. It says, it seems that regret and moral injury are very closely related. Does regret always lead to moral injury?
Regret is an indicator of moral injury. And the experience is what leads to moral injury, the presenting experience where the person feels regret. I would just turn it around. I would say regret is always associated with moral injury. It isn't the cause.
Very good. And a comment, signage is an interesting idea. One way I can think to apply that is at our Amanda Bell's farm. We have quite a few frontline healthcare workers that come out through the Star Nurse program, and also military veterans and other members of the community. So having signage along the lines of "You matter," "Here are some resources," "This is a space for you." I think that's a very applicable, tangible thing that we could be doing.
Absolutely.
If anyone else has any questions right now, feel free to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we can talk about them. Just another thought that I had. I think SCG is in a very unique position in our partnership with Cox Health. And once again, our Amanda Bell's farm to have a very strong connection and partnership with these communities, which I think a lot of our staff would agree. Yeah, that's really it. So I mean, I'm writing notes as you're going. This is just so applicable to our programming and what we do.
Yeah, and I appreciate how strong that that identity is at that location. You know, because you're distributed throughout community, sometimes resources such as getting involved in a positive activity are either persons don't know about the opportunity or they feel they can't access it. And a big challenge with especially people in the military, but it's not exclusive to them, is that, well, I tried to find help and I couldn't find it. And so I intentionally put it in the mission of Moral Injury Institute, kind of a pledge, don't push what you can't do, you know. So it's much better to simply invite than to make promises that may or may not be doable, you know. Because after all, the more important factor here is the engagement, to get the veteran or whoever we're talking about actually learning and doing, and you know, being in your intern program, or help them to develop the skills to do box gardening or whatever that might be. So I think there's a real service to this community that isn't being accessed, particularly, and I don't want to sound, I mean, you look at my photo, you're going to hear this as a generational slam. I don't mean it that way. The younger generations have very little experience with agriculture. I mean, they may have seen their mom do potted plants in the house, but that may be about it, you know. So targeting the younger generation, I think, is hugely important, and I think they're likely to be one of the more responsive parts of our military population.
I agree with that. A lot of our programming is focused on the Springfield community as a whole, and getting not only experienced gardeners like some of our garden leaders involved, but also having younger families and children and students in our gardens as well. So I think you're right on point there. We have another question. It says, if one were speaking with a veteran who suffered some kind of moral injury trauma, and in speaking with them, the vet were to open up about their sense of shame and regret rooted in a specific incident, is there anything to be aware of as a non-professional layman in terms of things not to say, statements to keep away from, or just general danger areas?
Well, I'll give you my pet peeve list. Don't say, did you kill anybody? What did it feel like to kill somebody? Don't you have some kind of responsibility for violence in our world? I mean, in other words, the accusative tone, whatever the language statement is, or the point of the inquiry, needs to be left alone. That needs to be avoided. What I think, and this just my experience now. I have, I don't know, maybe a dozen or more stories that I've videoed. It took the guy Dale in the video. It took him a year to decide that he would trust me with his story. And he only trusted me then in a therapist's office. So I would just simply say, just be as open, non-judgmental, non-critical, and let the person tell their story. It'll often be very emotional. This couple of weeks ago, a guy who is approaching 80 was talking to me about his family never affirmed him. He never felt love. He always sufficient, inadequate. And he just absolutely, like a child, he broke down in tears because the little child in him was hurting so badly. So if you can use transactional language in that way, we get emotionally frozen with our trauma. And so the trauma doesn't, we don't get objective. It's always subjective. And so that's why these inquiries need to be more like, do you want to talk about it? Is there something about that you want me to know? You talk about being sad. Do you have any idea where that's coming from? And then they'll share or they won't share. So we're not putting on the therapist cap here. We're just being a friend in that sense. But be prepared if they trust you sufficiently well to just let them. I have a friend who was he was a law enforcement officer. He shot someone in line of duty. He went off on about a 10-year dysfunctional path. And this was like 2 decades ago now. It took him 1 year to decide to tell me about that. When he did tell me, it was like he was reliving it. He talking about how hot it was that day, and he starts pulling at his clothes like clothes was sticking to him. He's agitated. He's re-experiencing that. Well, that was a huge breakthrough for him. And it doesn't mean that he doesn't need mental health therapy, but what it does mean is that now he's free of that that ghost that lived inside of him. He's now able to say, yeah, I can talk about that. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yes, that was very helpful. It sounds like being open and empathetic and asking open-ended questions instead of specific details or questions is better, those open-ended questions. We have another question.
Yeah, I mean, just I guess one way to think. Okay.
Feel free.
I was going to say, Anna, one way to think about this is to think about, and maybe you don't have any, so I'm not projecting onto you, but in my life, I can think about some things that I don't want to tell you. I'm really ashamed of it. I wish, I had a do-over, right? Well, we may all have some of that. I think that's a good place to be coming from when we're letting someone share their moral injury stories.
Okay, we have another question. It says, how can we help reach out to the people who are struggling to give them the opportunity to work on the farm with us? You mentioned earlier.
Go ahead.
This is an add-on of my own words. You mentioned earlier making sure that we're involving individuals specifically in physical hands-on activities. Do you think it's beneficial to have these kind of organizational relationships like between SCG and MMI? Or do you think individual outreach to military veterans should also be part of our outreach? So kind of two questions there.
Yeah, but I don't know if there's a single, best answer. Obviously, I have some prejudice, I guess you might say, in that I hope we can work together organizationally, and we're committed to that. But I think in our area, here in the Springfield area, if there's so many competitive organizations out there. I mean, I have a conversation. I've got to return to someone who just created a nonprofit to help veterans start gardens. Well, all that's, we are organizational heavy. And I forget the numbers of organizations. So sometimes just a straightforward outreach message to say, we would welcome persons who, are in our veterans and their families to come and learn about gardening and garden skills and co-ops and whatever it is you want to say. Another is to use organizations like VA clinics and so forth to communicate that as a resource. And so persons who are doing direct care with veterans would be able to say, hey, there's a resource here. Have you ever thought about getting involved in gardening? Well, maybe you want to contact, SCG, right?
Perhaps a little bit of both. Okay, those are all the questions we have right now.
All right. Well, I'm at the end of my presentation, except I found something that was shared from the Native American culture about COVID. And I don't know, it spoke to me. If we are, before we wrap, I'm going to share those couple of slides, but I'm not trying to rush us through either.
No, we have plenty of time.
Okay. All right. I'm going to pull them up. Oops, I went past it. Here we go. So this is actually, it was a Facebook post of all things, but it comes from Hopi Indian Chief White Eagle. recently this year talking about COVID. And maybe I'll just read it. You read it along with me and think about it. This moment that humanity is living through can be considered a hole. The decision to fall into the hole or go through the door is yours. If you consume information 24 hours a day with negative energy, constantly nervous, with pessimism, you will fall into this hole. But if you take the opportunity to look at yourself, to rethink life and death, to take care of yourself and others, you will go through the door. Here are the points then. Take care of your home, take care of your body, connect with your spiritual home. When you take care of yourself, you take care of others at the same time. Do not underestimate the spiritual dimension of this crisis. Adopt the perspective of an eagle that sees everything from above with a broader vision. There's social demand in this crisis, but also spiritual demand to go hand in hand. Without the social dimension, we fall into fanaticism. Without the spiritual dimension, we fall into pessimism and futility. You're prepared to go through this crisis. Grab your toolbox and use all the tools at your disposal. Learn to resist by the example of the Indian and African peoples. We've been and continue to be exterminated, but we never stop singing, dancing, lighting fires, and having joy. Don't feel guilty for feeling lucky in these difficult times. Being sad and without energy doesn't help at all. Resilience is resilience through joy. You have the right to be strong and positive. You have to maintain a beautiful, cheerful, bright posture. This has nothing to do with alienation. It's a strategy of resistance. When we walk in the door, we have a new view of the world because we faced our fears and our difficulties. This is what you can do now. Serenity in the storm, keep calm, meditate daily, make a habit of encountering the sacred, and demonstrate resilience through art, joy, trust, and love. Now, I think that philosophy, even though it was focused on COVID, is good life philosophy in general, but it speaks specifically into a part of the syndrome of moral injury, because sometimes moral injury is, we've heard of this survivor's guilt. A lot of military veterans, that kind of survivor's guilt and self, judgment, if you will, over something they didn't control at all, but they get so focused on the negative and the dark spaces in life and forget to focus on the positive. One of the artful things that I love seeing about your social media posts, SCG, is the outdoors, the open space, the green things, the flowering things, the productive things. That's really powerful stuff.
Very good, thank you. We have another comment, and feel free if you have any questions about any of the topics that we've talked about, feel free to put those in the Q&A section, or if you have any comments, put those in the chat box as well. This comment says, Dr. Goode's presentation has helped me realize the multiple benefits of SCG's mission. We often focus on feeding our physical bodies with our efforts. Our gardens have an equally important role in feeding spirits and souls, which I think is what we were just talking about. So that's
a double insight. Thumbs up on that one. That's great. Thank you, Patrick.
We'll leave the Q&A box and chat box open for a few more minutes in case anyone has any final thoughts or questions. Be happy to tackle those now. I was also thinking we have kind of an emphasis on connecting military veterans and frontline healthcare workers to our farm incubator sites, specifically at Amanda Bell's. But I mean, we also have our network of community gardens where I think we could be doing similar programming, because in my brain, these are just my thoughts. In my brain, the farm sites are such wonderful spaces to be and be still and have kind of that meditative state, but they are also for commercial production and making sure that we can fulfill our CSA and our other donations. But I think the gardens would be really good sites for slowing down and being able to really focus on, you know, hands in soil and harvesting and having that community, because a lot of our community gardens are neighborhood gardens. So being able to meet your neighbors and meet people that way. So I think that's something that we can maybe focus on more going forward. And we have another comment. It says, I have dealt with a lot of trauma myself, and through gardening, I felt a sense of healing as well. That's very good. Okay, and it was an informative presentation, and I think we're well positioned to help people that are carrying this weight. I think we should explore it. Thank you, Dr. Goode. And a few other, okay, very good. Any final questions before we wrap up for the day? While you're thinking about it, I'll just go ahead and do my spiel again. At the end of this workshop, there will be a pop-up screen that pops up with a link to our post-workshop survey. And that survey is used in our reporting to the USDA and also helps us provide meaningful workshops in the future. So it would be appreciated if everyone on here today could take a few minutes to fill that out, and I'll put that link in the chat box right now so that it is available. But Dr. Goode, thank you very much for being here today, and we appreciate you taking this time to begin this conversation and educate us on moral injury and how we can be aware of it in our programming.
Yeah, I'm sad that we have to have these conversations, but I'm delighted that for this opportunity, and hope we can follow up and